I think clearly there seem to be the two main things are, one, I think, is how do you think about integrating the work that has happened over the last decade in the financial inclusion space, and how do you start harnessing the capacity that countries have built under FI on whether it is digital payments or banking access, credit, or insurance access. How do you start harnessing that capacity along with technology developments like national ID and work in behavioral finance? So how do you start harnessing this capacity and using this for achieving pension inclusion among a population which is traditionally low income? And I think clearly the second gigantic challenge is how do you, from an administrative point of view, how do you bring this ecosystem together? So what I've seen in many countries is that typically in most developing countries, even countries with fairly modest income levels and so on and so forth, we see that most pieces that are required to implement an inclusive pension program already exist. So for instance, in a small country like Rwanda, they have fantastic national ID, they're beginning to do some great stuff on payments, they have insurance markets, they have fund managers, they have SACCOs and cooperatives and microfinance institutions for outreach, they have mobile payment guys who are running around doing mobile payments. So I think if I was to think of an inclusive pension program, I would need all of these things. But for low-income people, for let's say rich people, it's not very difficult to access any of this. But for low-income people, to get all of this through a single window, I think is the key. And I think you can use technology very effectively in integrating this. And I think technology can be that glue which can bind the financial inclusion ecosystem to deliver pension inclusion. Clearly, I think the first would probably be in just opening up the imagination and the way people are able to think about how to use FI and existing solutions as much as possible. I mean, it's in most developing countries, it's a pity to try and develop new institutions from scratch. And I think before we go out there and start thinking of new entities, I think if we can start imagining how we can use existing pieces, that is one key thing clearly. But when developing countries want to think about solutions, I mean, the intuition would normally be to look at, let's say, OECD countries which have done pension reforms in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. But typically what we are finding is that the underlying situations and the initial conditions in OECD countries are very different or were very different from the kind of conditions that we are seeing in most developing countries. So labor markets are very different, income levels are very different, literacy and financial literacy is very different, level of financial sector access is very different. Most people are in the informal, non-salaried workforce. So how do you really target individuals? So I think there is a limited value of, let's say, the experience, a huge experience undoubtedly that OECD countries have. So what I would think is one priority could be, can developing countries which look very similar regardless of size differences, can there be more lessons that we can learn from observing what others have done? And I think what we've seen, for instance, in India, I mean, while there are good lessons for, say, Bangladesh to look at India and say, okay, these are 3 good ideas, equally you will find that India has done 2 really crazy, silly things, and it's so much nicer for Bangladesh to learn from India's bad experience and perhaps avoid making the same mistakes that India did. So I think there is good learning, and that's something that I feel should be sort of an immediate step where countries come together, share ideas and experiences, and perhaps take better steps forward. The purpose behind the book project really is to, I think, sort of get policymakers and regulators and who are the key stakeholders to actually introspect deeply firstly, before they even go out and start thinking about what other countries are doing. I think it's quite important for people who are key stakeholders to actually introspect about what's happening or not happening in their countries. Now, wherever I have interacted with civil servants, for instance, I find that they're hugely well-meaning people. They really want to do good, but there is always this conflict between the urgent and the important. And I think invariably they're so busy trying to solve problems of today that they tend not to think deep enough about the fact that the problem of pensions in 2050 is actually a problem for today. It needs to be resolved today, otherwise 2040, 2030, 2050 would be too late. So I think to that extent the book project is sort of forcing people not only to think about what other countries are doing, but more importantly, what is it that we are doing or we need to do to perhaps provide more dignity in old age to our citizens. And I think that's a key focus. But going forward, I suspect that the book project, as the dissemination starts, as we start doing conferences and regional meetings, I think you will find that there'll be a sort of a pyramid of stakeholders. So we'll start perhaps with one or two people from each country, but as you go regional and as perhaps you even go country specific, you might need to, for instance, in Uganda, need to talk to 200 people in Uganda, and that can happen when we go down to a country level to perhaps at the last stage of this dissemination exercise. And I think in that context I'm hugely excited, and let's hope we are able to achieve what we are trying to.